All right, well, I see no reason to delay the show. Thank you for coming early. I really appreciate it. My name is William. I'm with Culpeper Battlefield Tours, as well as also on the board of directors Cedar Mountain Battlefield. Having people come out to our battlefields is big for preservation. This is how we get our stories out so that people become interested and engaged and become invested personally in coming out and preserving some of the most beautiful battlefields throughout the world, let alone in Virginia. So thank you very much for coming. Today, we're going to be talking about the Marines at First Manassas. Now, for those who don't know me, I am a journalist with the Marine Corps Association, and I promise you, they are not paying me to do this. I am doing this because the Marines have a unique and interesting relationship with the Battle of First Manassas, and I believe it is a story that is worth telling. So this lecture is called "The Cannonballs Are Flying Pretty Thick." On October 18th, 1859, Marines, under the direct command of Army Colonel Robert E. Lee, had trapped the radical abolitionist John Brown and his band in the small engine house of the United States Arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Hoping to use the weapons to arm a massive slave uprising, John Brown now found himself surrounded, isolated, and in the company of 10 hostages. When President James Buchanan heard of the supposed insurrection, he immediately ordered the only troops he had available to the scene of the action, less than 90 Marines led by Lieutenant Israel Green. After a brief round of negotiations with Lieutenant James Ewell Brown Stewart, who so happened to be near the Capitol when the raid began, the order was given for the Marines to storm the engine house. After attempting to break down the massive engine doors with sledgehammers, the Marines requisitioned a ladder, which they used to knock the door off its hinges. With his ceremonial sword drawn, Lieutenant Green led his Marines with fixed bayonets through the doors. Green described, quicker than thought, I brought my saber down with all my strength upon Brown's head. He was moving as the blow fell, and I suppose I did not strike him where I intended, for he received a deep saber cut in the back of his neck. He fell senseless on his side, then rolled over on his back. He had in his hand a short Sharps cavalry carbine. I think he had just fired as I reached Colonel Washington, for the Marines who followed me in the aperture made by the ladder received a bullet in the abdomen, from which he died in a few minutes. The shot might have been fired by someone else in the insurgent party, but I think it was from Brown. Instinctively, as Brown fell, I gave him a saber thrust in his left breast. The sword I carried was a light uniform weapon, and it either did not have a point, or striking something hard in Brown's accoutrements did not penetrate, the blade bent double. The sword that failed to kill John Brown allowed him to survive long enough to voice his fiery opinion, his anti-slavery rhetoric before the court of public opinion in the United States, although this did not save him from the hangman's noose from the legal court in the end. A year and a half after John Brown's raid, the nation was caught up in a much larger conflagration. Following the election of President Abraham Lincoln, 7 of the Cotton states seceded one by one. This then escalated to a violent confrontation at Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. Following the first shots of the war and Lincoln's call for troops, 4 more states of the Upper South promptly left the Union. The Marine Corps did not escape the schism that had torn the nation apart. 20 officers either resigned or dismissed after the resignations were rejected. 16 of these men would later fight for the Confederacy, including Lieutenant Israel Green, the man who himself had subdued John Brown. However, following the wave of patriotic fervor that swept the nation as the war began, President Lincoln ordered a special session of Congress on July 4th, 1861, which exponentially increased the size of the Marine Corps, much to the approval of Commandant John Harris. With a total pre-war strength of less than 1,800 officers and men, the Marine Corps now consists of 1 commandant to be given the rank of brigadier general, 2 colonels, 2 lieutenant colonels, 4 majors, 1 adjutant and inspector, 1 paymaster, 1 quartermaster, 2 assistant quartermasters, 30 captains, 40 first lieutenants, 30 second lieutenants, 2 sergeant majors, 2 quartermaster sergeants, 2 drum major, 2 principal musicians, 2 40 sergeants, 2 70 corporals, 3,000 privates, 50 musicians, 90 drummers, and 90 fifers. And just in case you were not keeping count of all of that, a total force of 3,862 men, effectively doubling the size of the Marine Corps. Following this exponential growth, the War Department made a special request to the Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, to form a battalion of Marines to augment the Army forming in the vicinity of Washington, D.C. Welles broke official protocol and went over the head of the Commandant by directly ordering several Marine officers to report to the Capitol and then assigning Major John George Reynolds command to lead the Marine Battalion. Born in 1801, Major Reynolds was a Mexican War veteran, having served for 35 years in the Marine Corps. With him were the 352 other officers and men who formed the ranks of the Marine Battalion. Formed into 4 companies, the Marine Battalion was composed largely of fresh recruits. Writing after the battle, Reynolds noted, "I am constrained to call to your attention to the fact that, when taken into consideration, the command was composed entirely of recruits, not one being in service over 3 weeks, and many had hardly learned their facings, the officers likewise being a short time in the service. Their conduct was such as to elicit only the highest commendation." The Marines of 1861 were hastily trained and readily equipped. They were garbed with a dark blue wool coat adorned with 7 large buttons, with white linen trousers and a white belt and polished brass above their black leather brogan boots. Atop his head, he wore a dark blue kepi, which was graced by a brass horn infantry badge with a red leather M positioned in the center, while their officers' caps were trimmed with black cording. He was armed with an M 1842 smoothbore musket, which they drilled to fire in mass volleys. As the quartermasters desperately attempted to assemble the equipment necessary to ready their men, the Marines were forced to do with a blanket rolled around their torso instead of packs. His canteen was the same issued to the Army, and his haversack contained his mess kit and other necessities. Lieutenant Robert E. Hitchcock described the formation and training of the newly formed Marine Battalion. "I must tell you why I do not and cannot write oftener. First, I am acting adjutant and take my regular duty as officer of the day with the rest of the Corps. Second, we have 377 raw recruits, and they have to be drilled 4 hours a day, and I have part of them to drill. We are short of drill sergeants, having only 4 at the present. This, you see, puts extra duty on me. Third, we have to study the tactics and military generally and recite to Major Reynolds, who is a graduate of West Point and very sharp upon point of a military character, and the result is that the recitation is 3 hours long sometimes." One Marine private, John E. Riley, wrote, "We will be drilled better in 1 month here than the volunteers would be in 6 months. On July 15th, 1861, orders from the Department of the Navy to the Commandant of the Marine Corps read, "You will be pleased to detail from the barracks 4 companies of 80 men each, the whole under the command of Major Reynolds, with the necessary officers, non-commissioned officers, and musicians for temporary field service under Brigadier General McDowell, to whom Major Reynolds will report. General McDowell will furnish the battalion with camp equipage, provisions, etc." Upon hearing rumors that the Marine Battalion was moving out before the order was issued, Second Lieutenant Robert Hitchcock of the Marines wrote to his parents, perhaps trying to encourage himself, "I hope the gods of battle will give me strength and wisdom to act wisely and do my duty well. I am not prepared to die, but I am prepared to serve my country and stand by the stars and stripes to the last. I am well and in good spirits. May God bless you all." To much fanfare, the Marines left their Washington barracks to join the ranks of Colonel Andrew Porter's 1st Brigade, 2nd Division, commanded by Brigadier General David Hunter, joining the ranks of the 8th New York State Militia, 14th Brooklyn, 27th New York, and the U.S. Infantry Regular Battalion, as well as artillery and a cavalry detachment. In describing his battalion's march through the field, Reynolds wrote, "The battalion left the barracks at headquarters in time to reach the Virginia end of the Potomac Long Bridge at 3 p.m. July 16, and proceeded up the Columbia Turnpike until an officer purporting to be the Assistant Adjutant General of Colonel Porter's brigade came up and assigned us position in the line of march, which was placed immediately in the rear of Captain Griffin's battery of flying artillery. This assignment was continued up to the period of the battle at Bull Run." Now, let's provide a little context to better understand what the Marines were up against as McDowell's army was marching towards Manassas Junction, which was a vital railroad hub linking the Shenandoah Valley to Richmond. Manassas Junction was a logistical necessity for any movement south to the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. Entrenched behind the meandering Bull Run Creek north of Manassas, a Confederate force awaited the Union advance. After a skirmish in the Confederate center on the 18th, McDowell planned to turn the Confederate left by way of an unprotected Sudley Ford. Leading this flanking column would be General Hunter's division, to which the Marine Battalion was attached. The flanking column awoke around 2:30 a.m. on the 21st of July and began their 9-mile march around the Confederate flank. As the column crossed Sudley Ford, the lead elements ran into Confederate troops near Matthews Hill. Colonel Porter describes his brigade's first taste of fighting along Matthew Hill. The head of the brigade was immediately turned slightly to the right in order to gain time and room for deployment on the right of the 2nd Brigade. Griffin's battery found its way through the timber out to the fields beyond, followed promptly by the Marines, with the 27th took direction more to the left. As Porter arrays his brigade into line to the right of the brigade of Colonel Ambrose Burnside, another brigade in his division, which is currently actively engaged with the enemy, he deploys his Marines on the far right flank, supporting Captain Charles Griffin's battery of artillery. Their participation on the right flank of the Union line consists of little fighting, although they lose 3 men to rebel artillery fire. Eventually, the weight of Union numbers began to take its toll as the Confederates are eventually pushed off Matthews Hill back onto Henry Hill. Colonel Porter will continue stating, "The prestige of success has thus far attended the efforts of our inexperienced but gallant troops. The lines of the enemy have been forcibly shifted nearly a mile to their left and rear. The flags of 8 regiments, though borne somewhat wearily, now pointed towards the hill, from which disordered masses of rebels have been seen hastily retiring. Griffin's and Ricketts batteries were ordered by the commanding general to the top of the hill on our right, supported them with fire Zouaves and Marines, while the 14th entered the skirt of woods on their right to protect that flank." So now let's then examine Major Reynolds' perspective. On reaching the field, and for some hours previously, the battery's accelerated march was such as to keep my command more or less in double quick time. Consequently, the men became fatigued or exhausted in strength. Being obliged at this period to halt in order to afford those in the rear an opportunity of closing up and taking their proper place in line, the battery was lost to protection from the force under my command. This I stated to Colonel Porter, who was ever present, watching the events of the day. The position of the battery was pointed out, and I was directed to afford the necessary support. The Marines crossed a small creek before marching up Henry Hill to support Griffin's battery on the Union left flank. Major Reynolds noted how, in taking this position, the battalion was exposed to a galling fire. The galling fire came from a line of Confederate artillery positioned just a few hundred yards before the advancing Marines. As Griffin detached a 2-gun section to outflank the Confederate artillery along the Union right flank, the Marines followed. Lieutenant Hitchcock, who had just written some weeks earlier, remarked how the cannonballs are flying pretty thick, just before an artillery round had hit him square in the face, decapitating him. As his lifeless body fell, a Marine reached out to grab him, only to be hit by another artillery shell, severing his arms and further mutilating the body of Lieutenant Hitchcock. The Marines were soon pushed back as a charge from the 33rd Virginia captured the 2-gun section. Their retreat was headlong to the advance of the advancing 14th Brooklyn, creating disorder as the 2 units tried to disentangle from each other. However, through the zeal of their officers, the men got back into formation. They were soon ordered back into the fight, with Reynolds writing, "General McDowell ordered the battalion to cover or support the 14th New York Regiment," which was the 14th Brooklyn, which was about to be engaged. The battalion, in consequence, took the position indicated by the general, but was unable to hold it, owing to the heavy fire which was opened upon them. The Marines in 14th Brooklyn pushed back the 33rd Virginia, thus uncovering the left flank of the Confederate regiment next in line, the 2nd Virginia, which was also pushed back. This exposed the flank of the Confederate artillery on Henry's Hill. This attack of the Marines in the 14th Brooklyn was corroborated by the opposing side in a report written by Brigadier General Thomas Jackson, who noted, "The enemy, not being able to force our lines by direct fire of artillery, inclined part of his batteries to the right, so as to attain an oblique fire, but in doing so exposed his pieces to a more destructive fire from our artillery, and one of his batteries was thrown so near to Colonel Cummings that it fell into his hands in consequence of having made a gallant charge on it with his regiment. But, owing to a destructive small-arm fire from the enemy, he was forced to abandon it." At 3:30 p.m., the advance of the enemy, having reached a position which called for the use of the bayonet, I gave command for a charge of the more than brave 4th and 27th, and, under commanders worthy of such regiments, they in order in which they were posted, rushed forward obliquely to the left of our batteries, and through the blessings of God who gave us victory, pierced the enemy's center. In another testament from the enemy, Surgeon Daniel M. Comrade of the 2nd Virginia, which had been pushed off the field by the 14th Brooklyn Marine Battalion, wrote, "The green pines were filled with the 79th Highlanders and the red breech Brooklyn Zouaves, but the only men that were killed and wounded 20 or 30 yards behind and in the rear of our lines were the United States Marines." In supporting the 14th Brooklyn, Colonel Porter noted, "The evanescent courage of the Zouaves prompted them to fire perhaps 100 shots, when they broke and fled, leaving the batteries open to a charge of the enemy's cavalry, which took place immediately. The Marines also, in spite of the exertions of their gallant officers, gave way in disorder. The Confederate counterattack pushed back the 14th Brooklyn Marine Battalion, but as Major Reynolds explained, they broke 3 times several, but as frequently formed and urged back into position. These Marines are going back into the fight repeatedly." The Marine Battalion were formed to then join in another assault against the Confederate position atop Henry Hill, including supporting the 69th New York in one of the final assaults. One Marine named Private William Barrett recorded how, "We were the first to assist the 69th New York. We faced them on the left of the battery, and when 50 yards from it, our men fell like hailstones. I had only fired 3 shots when my musket received a ball right at the lock, which put me back about 3 feet. As soon as I came to my ground again, 2 men were shot down on my right and 1 on my left. About this time, I began to look very warlike. As for my part, I thought I would lose all presence of mind in such a place, but it was quite different. I was as cool as a cucumber." Most Marines would probably feel the same way today in combat. Unfortunately, the zeal of the Marines was not enough to push back the well-trained and organized Confederate defenses atop Henry Hill, and a coordinated counterattack forced the Federals back. Porter recalled, "All efforts were futile. The words, gestures, and threats of officers were thrown away upon men who had lost all presence of mind and only longed for the absence of body." Reynolds also wrote, "A general rout took place in which the Marines participated. No effort on the part of the officers could induce them to rally. The Federal retreat to Washington, D.C. was abysmal. As Reynolds later described, the abrupt and hasty retreat from the field of battle presents a deplorable deficiency in both arms and equipment. The rout being of such general character, the men of all arms commingled. The only alternative left was to hasten to the ground occupied by the brigade to which we were attached on the morning of the day of the battle. On my way thither, I had the good fortune to fall in with General Meigs, whose consternation at the disastrous retreat was depicted upon his countenance. He was of the opinion the army should hasten to Arlington, fearing otherwise the enemy would follow up their success and cut off the road. My men being weary and much exhausted, without blankets and other necessaries, I determined to strengthen such as should pass the wagons by, hot coffee, and move on to the headquarters at Washington City, where their wants could be supplied. The Marine Battalion returned to their barracks as a wreck. The dead included Lieutenant Hitchcock, Private John Riley, the young Marine, an Irishman who claimed that in 1 month they'd be better trained than volunteers in 6 months. Another Irishman named Private John Stanley, Private Samuel Clegg, a machinist from Philadelphia, Private Francis Harris, an Irishman from Pittsburgh, Private Martin Ward, another Irishman, and Private Benjamin Perkins, also from Ireland. 2 more were listed as killed but were prisoners of war, with 35 men also being wounded or captured, a grand total of 44 casualties. Writing after the battle, both Reynolds and Porter give high marks to the Marines, the former stating, "The 350 officers and enlisted men under my command, there were but 2 staff officers, 2 captains, 1 first lieutenant, and 9 commissioned officers, and 2 musicians who were experienced from length of service. The remainder were, of course, raw recruits, which being considered, I am happy to report the good conduct of officers and men. The officers, although but little experienced, were zealous in their effort to carry out my orders." In the death of Lieutenant Hitchcock, the Corps has been deprived of a valuable acquisition. On the field, he was ever present and zealous. He sought and won the approbation of his commanding and brother officers. Porter wrote, "Marine Major Reynolds, Marines, whose zealous efforts were well sustained by his subordinates, two of whom, Brevet Major Zellin and Lieutenant Hale, were wounded, and one Lieutenant Hitchcock lost his life. However, upon seeing Reynolds' statements, Commandant Harris famously wrote to the Secretary of the Navy how this was the first instance in history where any portion of its members turned their backs on the enemy. And this statement has haunted the Marine Corps ever since. However, in relation to many of the other Union regiments at Manassas, the Marine Battalion ranks with the exceptional, among such high-performing regiments as the 1st Minnesota or 14th Brooklyn. This was done despite little formal training, and it's impressive considering that other regiments, such as the 74th New York, were not unable to get into formation when ordered to advance. It should be no shame that the Marines were forced to retreat in the face of a rapidly deteriorating situation brought about by poor leadership. And it's no dishonor that one of the worst defeats suffered by the Marine Corps was brought about by a brigade of Virginians who formed one of the most elite units of the Confederate States of America and were led by one of the greatest generals in American history. Any Marine who faces the gargantuan statue of Brigadier General Thomas Stonewall Jackson on the Manassas battlefield needs only to glance over to the right to see where his fellow Marines made the furthest advance into Confederate lines during the first major battle of the American Civil War. Thank you very much.